Last one before lunch, always a challenge. So I'm Jacqui and I work in the research and development team at the Environment Agency, focusing on flood risk management. So like everyone today, I'm going to explain a bit about what we do in the whole world of flood risk for those of you not embedded in it on a daily basis, and to talk about some of the uncertainties and decisions that we have, which will replicate some of the ideas put forward already about spanning different policy areas, spanning different needs, aspirations. So, flood risk, for those of you who don't live and breathe this on a daily basis, I'm going to explain this for England. I'm quite aware of my Natural Resources Wales colleagues here, but a lot of this applies across the UK, essentially. So the type of flood risk we have includes coastal flood risk, groundwater flood risk, or water rises through the ground into your house. We have surface water flood risk, which is when drains are overwhelmed by extreme rainfall. We have thunderstorms, which cause fast floods, kind of Boscastle for those who remember that. And we have river flooding. All of those exist across England. The kind of nature of flooding that we have in this country is that we don't have much lead time before it's about to happen. Just thinking about what's happening at the States at the minute, where the hurricane's been approaching for days and days. We don't have that level of lead time when we cope with flooding in this country. The best we often hope for is certainty with about 12 hours notice, not several days. The kind of scale, specifically in England, of flood risk and how we measure it, as you can see up here, is that we look at the probability of flooding, measured in 3 different ways: high probability, 1 in 30 chance; medium, 1 in 30 to 1 in 100; and low, which is 1 in 100 to 1 in 1,000. And we look at the probability of flood of different types, measure the number of homes, and as you can see there, 200,000 homes are at risk in England from flooding from the rivers and the sea, and from surface water, a similar figure. So that's the scale of flood risk that we are coping with in England specifically. And responsibility falls under different bodies. Flooding from rivers and the sea is a responsibility for the Environment Agency, and local authorities are responsible for managing flooding from surface water and groundwater. But the Environment Agency has a sort of strategic overview. It leads on advising how to manage flood risk generally. So that's the scale of what we're dealing with. But obviously in the world of climate change, that scale will change, and what risk looks like will change over time. This is from UK Climate Change Projections 09. The new ones are coming out in November, fingers crossed. And under climate change, we will expect higher extremes, greater extremes of rainfall, sea level rise, and consequent more extreme coastal flooding and coastal erosion. So that's the context of flood risk in this country. And for those who are unaware about what flooding does, it has multiple impacts at both an individual level, local level, and a national economic level, potentially. So for people who are flooded, it usually costs on average £30,000 of damage to your home. Most people are out of their homes, living somewhere else, where their homes are stripped to the bare bones, repaired. Usually out of their homes for about 6 months while that happens. There is an associated distress there. We know now that flooding causes quite severe mental health issues for people. So there's the individual issues. It can affect businesses, larger businesses, such as if Tesco gets flooded, they can strip and reinstate everything quite quickly. If you're a smaller business, getting flooded can be the end, essentially. Lots of places where they have flooding, businesses are damaged and they never come back again, which can then have consequences for the local economy and the local community. It can affect infrastructure, as the Dawlish train line, a great example of, which can affect regional economies. It also affects public buildings, which can be anything from a school, which then affects local communities, or it could be a GP surgery, a hospital. So there's huge numbers of impacts of flooding at different scales. So what do we do about it? There are a whole host of things which can be done, depending on where you are and what you're protecting. So obviously the big famous examples of what we can do to reduce flood risk, such as the Thames Barrier. We can build nice concrete walls along things. We can do more innovative things. Natural flood management is quite a big area at the minute. To what extent can we work with natural processes to reduce flood risk? We can have temporary barriers, which is when you do have 12 hours warning, you can use some large trucks and transport some barriers and put them in place just before a flood happens. We can use the planning system to try and stop flooding before the infrastructure is ever at risk, or maybe design that infrastructure so it can flood. Or you can do things at a local level where individuals put measure on their homes, so if they do flood, it doesn't have such an impact and they can wash it away or put barriers up to stop the water getting in the first place. There's a whole host of things that can be done to mitigate flood damage. So deciding on what measures to put in, where to address these issues is done at a local level and a national level. So at a local level, there are plans. Like when you come to an event, people always steal the stuff locally, don't they? Like the Cambridge corridor. So at a local level, you can see the river basin management plans, look at a river catchment to see what measures need to be put in place, what is the risk in a place, what measures need to be put in place to reduce that risk, and what are the priorities for reducing that risk over time. So local plans address a kind of catchment scale flood risk. Local authorities put in place plans to look at the surface water flood risks, so strategic flood risk management plans for surface water. There are also plans along the coast, so all around the coast of the UK there are shoreline management plans put in place to look at how to manage the flood risk in the medium to long term. But all of these things have to acknowledge uncertainty and work with it. And just thinking about uncertainty in landscape decisions, when I was digging some of these out, it was really interesting to note if you look for how uncertainty is managed in decision making, it's a bit of a narrative as opposed to a structured or systematic approach to using uncertainty. The shoreline management plans, how do we make sure the plan is both robust and flexible in the face of uncertainties? How do they? That's just a question. There is no answer to that question. And this is making really tricky decisions about which parts of the coast to invest in so that villages are sustained in the long term. Because if you don't, they may fall into the sea or are essentially not sustainable in the long term. And then again, at the river catchments, have we considered what might happen if flood risk is worse than previously considered? Well, have we? And what's the response to that? So at the minute, uncertainty is addressed at a local scale as a kind of narrative, a kind of expert judgment approach, as opposed to systematically embedded the ideas of uncertainty in decision making within these plans. And then at a national level, we obviously need to ask questions such as how much nationally should we invest to reduce flood risk? There are lots of competing priorities, obviously. So what do we need at a national level? How much money do we need? So we have something at the Environment Agency called long-term investment scenarios, where we balance up the economic damage of flooding, how risk will change over time, what assets we need to mitigate that risk, what interventions we put into place, and what the balance of all that is. So it's a big juggling act in a big report. So that's what we do at a kind of national level to consider what investment we need. So embedded in all of that are our uncertainties about the future. So some of these have been discussed a little bit already. Climate change uncertainty, how bad will it be? And which scenarios should we be planning for and investing in? So what extremes, what sea level rise will it be? How big will waves be in the future? Non-stationarity, this is something we're increasingly thinking about, in that we often use the last 30 years of data to predict what the next 30 years will look like. But that's making assumptions that all the parameters, the characteristics of the last 30 years can then be replicated for the next 30 years. So non-stationarity in climate and land use, it's something that is suddenly coming to the fore a little bit more. So how do we manage that? Land use change. So obviously, lots of people have talked already about infrastructure change, housing change, landscape change and the quality of change, and all of those things will change the flood risk in some way. Either it will increase, it can work with it. So there are lots of feedback loops within how the landscape changes and to how flood risk will change as a consequence. Changing exposure. So we only ever care about floods if they affect people or infrastructure, essentially. So how will that exposure change over the next 25 to 50 years, or maybe 100 years? How many people will live in flood risk areas, but also what are the characteristics of those people? This graph here shows the extent to which people have flood insurance, depending on whether they own their own homes, whether they're renting, etc. And it varies hugely. And then that affects the extent to which people may pay to make their homes more resilient, if they'll care about their flood risk because they own their homes or they don't own their homes. So the characteristics of the population are really key to understanding the extent to which flooding may affect people. Development control, spatial planning, how many homes do we need? How much flood risk will there be if homes are developed in certain areas? Infrastructure's already been mentioned. And land use change again with elements of agricultural change. So if there are big policy changes in agriculture and land use, how does that subsequently affect runoff? With the climate change, we're quite aware that grass species may change. Now in the UK there are thousands of kilometres of grass embankments which form a huge amount of the flood defence infrastructure of the UK. So if you have climate change and all the species change on that grass embankment, how do you maintain it, and what happens to the condition of those assets? One of the other interesting elements of exposure and changing risk is the scale at which process happens and the scale at which decisions happen and the scale at which investment happens, all of which are completely different. So it's always interesting to see people's Natural England habitat classification is done on a specific scale for that requirement. Investment might be done at a local authority level, and that's the decision. From a flood risk perspective, we'd like everything to be done from a catchment perspective. Obviously that never happens. I live in West Yorkshire, and the River Aire catchment that flows through Leeds goes through at least 4 different local authorities. So the scale and of decision making and how that affects the kind of changing exposure of people and infrastructure, and then the scale of the process that happens that affect flood risks, is a different thing to balance, marry together and understand. Decision making. So what decisions are we thinking about in the Environment Agency? We're currently rewriting the National Flood Risk Strategy for the next 25 years to go along the 25-year Environment Plan. And within that, there are obviously lots of decisions to be made. Coming back to what do we invest in? So how do you juggle all these different types of interventions at a local scale, at a regional scale, at a national scale? Because in some areas, an intervention may not just reduce the flood risk to people, but it facilitates economic growth and housing growth in certain areas. So the driver may be completely outside of flood risk to some extent. The key driver might be associated with housing. And in different places, you have legacy infrastructure, you have different local requirements which necessitate a whole mosaic of measures, and how to make decisions around what to put where and when is a big challenge. What we've often done in the past is just think, this is from our long-term investment strategies. 2014, we just looked at the number of assets we have and what they protect and how much risk there is as a consequence of those assets being in place. But then if you think about a whole portfolio of responses, someone mentioned earlier on the economics behind this. If you optimise your economics, are you actually making the wrong decision about what investments to make? Because it may be that your economic optimum isn't the right decision to make. And also we have this challenge of the timing of replacing things. So in our long-term investment scenarios, our economics, we look at how our condition grades for our assets, so if they're very good asset to very poor, when they get to a certain condition, then we replace it in a sort of robotic type way. But it might be better to replace it at a different time, but your economics might not follow that up because it might be more expensive to replace it earlier, but then there are other factors which mean that's actually a better decision to make. And also, what scale of flooding do we want to protect a local area or a nation from, essentially? In the Netherlands, they have a legal protection status for flooding. They protect to a certain level. We don't have that in this country. So what should drive that? And equally, one of the decisions we have to think about is, where is the threshold for change? If you think about the coast, if you have a community that is flooded a certain number of times, how many times does it need to be flooded before that community is no longer sustainable? So it may cope with a certain magnitude, but it may not cope with a certain number of those because the businesses may move out. The infrastructure repair time might be so much that people just, it's no longer sustainable. So there is the scale of flood that you need to defend for, but also what kind of thresholds for change might there be for infrastructure, communities, landscape that we need to think about. And also, at what scale do you invest and make your decisions? Property, according to major assets, catchment scale, the importance of urban areas, and all these scales interact. So one of the things we essentially need, when I was talking to people at the Environment Agency today, saying, what would you like me to come back with after 2 days in Cambridge? One of the key things is knowing how to make a decision under uncertain conditions. Are we using the best tools to make those decisions? So do we need to use a different metric to make our decisions? Are we following the right decision pathways? Are there alternative approaches that we really need to be thinking about, that we're completely unaware of, that we can steal from other disciplines in our decision making? And I think one of the things which was mentioned earlier on today is about the interactions between different components, what we need to make decisions on. We live in a siloed flood risk world at the Environment Agency, but increasingly, it is the right thing in the future to make those decisions with the interactions between landscape change, infrastructure, agriculture, etc. Ian mentioned a whole list of different policies, and I was thinking, yes, we need to account for that one, that one, that one, that one. But if you do that, what is the what are the connections between all those different policies, and how do we understand those sufficiently to make the right decisions? So, just a little ask from the Environment Agency, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jacqui. Brilliant. Chance for a couple of questions? James?
Very interesting. I was wondering, maybe it's a question to you and maybe to the other speakers after coffee, is what's the approach to evidence in making these decisions? I think in particularly for flood management, there's this idea, we use the word, that planting trees is fantastic for flood management. But the evidence is, based on the reviews, that it's extremely variable and we don't really understand why it works and when it works. So I was just wondering how the evidence, the scientific evidence, plugs into the sort of things you were talking about.
Yeah, I think obviously we like to think of ourselves as an evidence-based organisation, but the planting trees one is a really good example in that we don't know what the flood risk benefits are. It's seen as a really good thing to do. Is it a good thing from a landscape perspective because it achieves multiple benefits? It might achieve tourism, water quality improvements, and the flood risk might be just one of those elements. So there's a kind of balance between taking it forward because it's the kind of the nice thing to do at the minute, and the order of the day. It's like the choice of preference of flood risk interventions, but it needs to be balanced against what it can achieve. But maybe there are some places where there's the opportunity to do that. It will achieve a whole suite of benefits, and then we need to monitor what they are to make sure it was the right choice. So it's a fine balance between a kind of no regrets, let's try it, but accepting that it's just got to be one of the part of a number of measures for a catchment, and equally it should be done because it achieves multiple benefits, not just flood risk.
Yeah, if I can build on that, I've seen some examples, the air being one, you mentioned the air, the new scheme where they indeed propose to plant a lot of trees, and I fully agree with you that can have multiple benefits, but what's not then done, what's not done then, is to, if you have, say, 10 million for tree planting, that you say, well, 5 million is for carbon sequestration, and that you try to budget a little bit. So now sometimes the trees are put forward for flood risk, while, like this gentleman said, we don't know yet, or actually it's dubious, but that secretly under the carpet it's for carbon sequestration. So it's not clear how it is argued what the benefits are.
Well, I mean, there are very strict rules as to what you can invest, how you can invest flood risk management money to reduce flood risk. So things like tree planting has to prove the benefit of what flood risk that reductions then would do. So it's something that ought to be done as part of a catchment-based response, as a holistic approach to just managing the catchment, and tree planting has a component of that is flood risk reduction. But I think maybe some ideas that we're spending £10 million on just tree planting, with a kind of idea that it reduces flood risk, and then there's some secret benefits underneath. I'm not quite sure that happens particularly. I think it's in its very early stages, that kind of catchment-based approach. And one of the challenges essentially is how do you optimise investment in a catchment? So you reduce flood risk, you address multiple other issues at the same time, and how do you optimise those decisions? It's one of the key challenges.
Well, I agree with you that sometimes you have to have a pilot study, and quite big, just to see how it works out. Otherwise, you never know.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got time for one last question.
Is real options thinking something you already do, or was that something you were thinking we should talk about in the meeting?
Can you define your version of real options
Well,
thinking?
real options, my experience comes from the oil industry. It's where you make a virtue of procrastination. You delay your decisions until the last possible moment, so that you can gather more information before you make the decision.
Okay.
Value in uncertainty.
Yeah, no, I think this is one of the key questions actually. So Thames 2100 programme looking at flood risk management in the Thames in the future has got something called an adaptation pathway. So essentially there are points at which you make a decision, and you then, if sea level rise is higher than expected, if economic growth is different to what expected, then you've got different pathways. The challenge is having the data at the right point to make your decision full enough in advance. So work at Southampton University has suggested you need X amount of data to be fully confident of which direction that pathway is going in. So I think it's one of the key challenges actually is understanding the threshold, or knowing when you're close enough to that threshold to make the right decision with sufficient years in advance to change to the right pathway.
Okay, thank you very much.